Welcome. This video will show us how to take an equation that's in standard form and rewrite it in slope-intercept form. Now remember, slope-intercept form is where we have the y isolated by itself, the slope times this x variable plus b, so it has to be in y equals mx plus b form. So let's go ahead and take the equation 11x plus 8y equals a negative 24. And we'll subtract the x term from each side because the y has to be by itself. The 11 minus 11x goes to 0, so we end up with 8y equals a negative 11x, or negative 24 minus 11x. We'll divide each side by 8, and we have to divide everything by 8. If we do it to one thing, we have to do it to everything. 8 over 8 goes to 1, so I end up with 1y equals a negative 24 divided by 8 gives me a negative 3, and then the 11 over 8x just stays just like it is. Now we're going to rewrite this in slope-intercept form, so that means the x term has to come first, and the y-intercept has to be second. So the mx term comes first, and the y-intercept comes second. So if we look at our choices, it looks like this has to be letter A is our right choice. Okay, this next equation, what we have to do is write an equation that goes through the following 2 points. So we have to use these 2 points to come up with our equation. First of all, I hope you notice that 0 and a negative 2, that negative 2 is the y-intercept. Anytime you have 0 for x, the number to the right of it, in the y position, is the y-intercept. So now we have to find the slope. Let's go ahead and create ourselves a table. I have a negative 3 and a negative 5, and I have a 0 and a negative 2. I'm going to find the slope by finding the changes in the y. That goes up by 3, and the change in the x also goes up by 3. Now we know that the slope has to be the change in the y's divided by the change in the x's. So we have 3 divided by 3, and that slope simplifies to simply just 1. Now we'll use our slope-intercept form. We know that m equals 1 and b equals a negative 2. The slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b. Now we'll go ahead and substitute the slope in for 1 in for m and a negative 2 in for b. Now if we look at our equations, none of them work. So it looks like C may be the right solution. So I think the best idea when you have none of these or none of the above, what we need to do is check to make sure what we've got is the right equation. This means that we're going to substitute a negative 3 in for x, and we should get a negative 5 out for our y. So we take our equation 1x, and x is a negative 3 minus 2, and we put that in our calculator. We do get a negative 5, so that checks out for the first point. We'll go ahead and check it for the second point. We'll use 0 for x, and then if we have the right equation, we should get a negative 2 for the y. All right, let's go ahead and substitute it in. We have y equals 1 times x, and the x that we're going to use is 0. We'll subtract 2, and if you type that in your equation, you end up getting a negative 2 for your y, so it does check out. So we do have the right equation. So that means that there's none of these that will work. Okay, our next one is almost the same thing. We're giving a point and a slope, and we're supposed to come up with the equation. M equals a -2, so that is given for us. Now, if you look at the point here is not the, so that point that point 3 and -1 is not the y-intercept. So we have to do something to find the y-intercept. Now remember, the y-intercept has to be a point where 0 is the x and the number that follows with it is the y-intercept. So we have to find it. Now we know the slope is 2/3. So if I take 2/3, we know that changing the y's are on the top, the x's are on the bottom, and for the x go up by a +3, and the y's go up by a +2, I can create myself a little bit of a table to tell me what the y-intercept is. We're going to go ahead and start with the point 3 and -1. And let's say if I go down, I'm going up, so I'm going to add 3. So if I add 3 to 3, that'll give me 6. Now on the -1, I'm going up, so I'm going to add 2 to the y, and that'll give me a 1. So there's one ordered pair that's 6 and 1 if I go up. So in other words, I have to go down because 6 and 1 is not the y-intercept. It's not what I'm looking for. So let's go the other way. Let's take a -3, add it to 3, and that does give me 0. So I'm going the right way. So because I know that if I have 0 for the x, the other part of the ordered pair has to be the y-intercept. Now I'm going to go down a -2 because I'm going a different way, and that will give me a -3. So the y-intercept has to be 0, -3. That's it. That's what we're looking for. Now once we find that, we can go ahead and pick out the right equation. So y equals, the slope is 2/3. And remember that our equation has to fit the slope-intercept form. We have 2/3 times x, and the b is a -3. If we go ahead and look at that, we can see that that is choice E. Okay, our last problem is we have to match the graph with the equation. It is basically a way that we can tell if you really know how to graph an equation. First thing we want to do is make a table. Okay, we have our x column and our y column. Now the first x we want to choose is always 0. The next x, we want to take it from the denominator, or the second x. The second x will always be the denominator. Now remember, if you don't have a denominator, you can use the number 1. So we'll use x equals 2. And then the third choice that we have is we're going to change the sign of the denominator and make it a negative denominator. Now we have to find out what our y's are. We'll take our equation, -7 divided by 2, we will replace the x with 0, and now subtract 2, and that will give us the ordered pair of a -2. So when x is 0, y is a -2. Let's go ahead and type it in with our calculator. This will make it a little bit easier to figure the other ones. Put 0 in, we subtract 2. I do get to -2, so I know that it's right. Now we'll go ahead for our next x. We'll choose 2, so we'll replace the 0 with a 2. That'll give us a -9. And now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go up and edit this equation, and we will replace 2 with a negative 2. And I get a 5. Now let's take a look at the different graphs that we have. If you look at the y-intercept, it should be a negative 2. You can see that negative 2 is not the y-intercept on that one, so most likely B is not it. It looks like it's not on E. It is on D, and then I have a positive 2 on C. So that gives me some ideas to eliminate. So I think the next equation that we really need to look at is really what's happening with D. Now if you look at D at 2 on the X, it's 5 on the Y. Now there's an issue with that, isn't there? If I look over at my table, looks like I'm crossing all the ones that don't work out. So it looks like maybe none of these have to be a possibility.